Hi, everyone. So excited to welcome you to this panel. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the US. My name is Michelle Deutschman. I'm the Executive Director of the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement, and I'm excited to welcome you here today to this program that we are proudly partnering with PEN America on. For those of you that are new to the center, we were formed by former UC President Janet Napolitano in 2017. And our mission is to explore the intersection of expression, engagement, and democratic learning, and consider what can be done to restore trust in the value of free speech on college campuses and within society at large. We endeavor to fulfill our mission through programming, research, and resources, all available at no cost, including our monthly podcast, webinars like this one, and our annual Speech Matters conference, which will be taking place virtually on April 18th, so mark your calendars. Each year, we select individuals from across the country to take part in our National Fellows Program. Applications for that will open in January. I am proud to share that today's moderator, Lara Schwartz, was a member of our second class of fellows, and we are so proud of all of the incredible work she did as a fellow and continues to do. We also facilitate workshops about how to simultaneously safeguard expression while maintaining inclusion, diversity, and equity. We're dropping a link to our website into the chat. Please subscribe to our mailing list. Every year in this role, I think to myself, there could not be a more important time to educate stakeholders in higher education about the First Amendment and expression and how those things connect with our democracy. And each year, the stakes get higher. This current moment has been a challenging and heart-wrenching one. Questions abound, including on today's topic about institutional speech. I am confident that today's discussion will be dynamic and that it will likely raise new questions for us to grapple with. I see this as the beginning of a conversation, one that I look forward to continuing, and I want to thank PEN America and our esteemed panelists for their partnership and participation today. I am now going to turn it over to Kristen Shaverdian from PEN America. Thanks so much.
Hello, everyone. So glad so many people could join us today. My name is Kristen Shaverdian. I'm the Senior Manager of Free Expression and Education at PEN America. PEN America is a nonprofit organization that stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect open expression in the United States and worldwide. We are thrilled to partner today with the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement on this very important and timely panel. In PEN America's Free Expression and Education program, we've carved out a unique role bridging the steep divides in debates over questions of free speech and inclusion on college campuses. Through our efforts, we have studied and set out original perspectives in our reports on how the many issues facing campuses today, from speaker invitations to faculty speech and campus protests, can be addressed in ways that protect free speech, while also acknowledging the concerns of marginalized and historically underrepresented groups. Our advice is housed online in our Campus Free Speech Guide, which offers practical, principled advice on free speech and inclusion on U.S. college campuses. And we offer advice to campuses through our Campus for All programming. And two of our panelists today are part of that programming as well. This professional development series covers the basics of free speech on campus and equips academic leaders, faculty, and staff to respond to a range of scenarios involving academic freedom, hate, and difficult dialogue. We also offer educational programming on free expression for students. Information on these programs will be shared in the chat, and it's also available on PEN America's website at pen.org. I am now thrilled to introduce our moderator for today's panel, Lara Schwartz. Lara is from American University, and her forthcoming book, Try to Love the Questions, gives college students the framework for understanding and practicing dialogue across difference. And now I will turn the rest of our time over to Lara, and our panelists. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. I am so pleased to be here. Let's get going. A principle of dialogue is to do it, to get the conversation started. Our national conversation about institutional statements has really fired up and become more focused in recent weeks and months. This is a thing that a lot of us, in particular the people on our panel today, have been thinking about for quite some time. At least since the now famous Calvin report, which encouraged universities to adopt positions of postures of neutrality with regard to social action, both in their institutional positioning and in particular in the statements that they made. This idea is becoming more, has been getting a lot of attention in recent weeks as we've seen campuses, but also corporate environments, nonprofit organizations locked in struggle over whether institutional statements about this corporate we, what we believe, who we are, what we tolerate, what has a place on our campus, fall short and manage to unify people only in their anger and dissatisfaction. So this is what we're going to be focusing on today. We have outstanding panelists on this. Just to give you a sense of the flow of show, we have a Q&A function that we'll be watching so that even though your microphones aren't on, you can get into the dialogue by posing your questions in the Q&A function. We'll be watching those and hopefully incorporating them into the panel. In just a moment, I'm going to turn it over to our three panelists for short introductions on their perspectives of this topic. And then we're going to go into some prepared questions that I have about the whether, when, and what else of institutional statements before moving to the Q&A component. So I'm first going to, I think I said the first person was going to be Neijma. Neijma, if you'd like to begin, I'll stop my video.
Hello, everyone. I apologize. I am dealing with some allergies, but my name is Neijma Celestine-Donnor, and I am the Associate Dean of Equity and Inclusion and Strategic Initiatives at the University of Maryland in Baltimore. And this issue has been something that I have been grappling with managing on my campus and other campuses that I've worked at for several years. I have a law degree as well as a social work degree, and that is relevant because it really shapes the way that I think about and approach these issues. So I am a big advocate for the First Amendment, and I also spend a lot of my time as a trauma clinician. And so I understand the impact that very legal actions can have and how it can create harm. And in my role as the Dean for DEI, inclusion and equity is also really important. So I sit at the intersection of the law, of impact, and of inclusion, and that very much shapes the way that I think about these issues. Because I don't think that it is black and white. There's so much nuance to it. So I'm excited to be here and contribute to the discussion. Thanks, Lara.
Next, we'll hear an introduction from Tom Ginsburg.
Yes, I'm Tom Ginsburg. I'm a professor of international law at the University of Chicago Law School, and I'm running a new initiative called our Forum for Free Inquiry and Expression, which is really kind of carrying forward the university's very old tradition on free speech. The Calvin report, of course, has come into the fore since the massacres in Israel and the response. And it turns out that actually the Calvin report principles go back to the very founding of the University of Chicago. So it's a very long tradition of the university staying sort of keeping its mouth shut. And just to very quickly explain that, it's not that we are neutral as between, truth and lies, democracy and, dictatorship and such. It's always a question of who is the we. We don't trust our leaders in some sense enough to speak for a plural university campus. And our view is that the mission of universities being to discover for students and faculty is best advanced by a neutral position or a silence, generally speaking, on faraway events in the public sphere. So maybe that's all I'll say now. I know we'll talk much more about the substance of the ideas.
And last but not least, John.
Hello, everyone. John Wilson, former president of Morehouse College, and also currently a visiting professor at Morgan State University. The question of speaking up or staying silent is an odd one to me, based on my perspective on American higher education. I say that because since 1636, when American higher education was born, with Harvard being born, the silence of most of higher education has been deafening in the face of so much that is going on in the world. I've just written a book called Hope and Healing: Black Colleges and the Future of American Democracy, which argues, makes the case that silence right now at this point is betrayal. And that book points out that basically the HBCU tradition, because they were not standing by and silent, leaned in and paid attention that we are educating people and preparing them for the world. Therefore, we need to care about what's going on in the world. So that's a very different tradition, and it's at odds fundamentally with the Calvin Report. One thing I'll say by way of closure, I'm going to speak about that tradition more as we go through this, but I think we're at a distinctive time right now in this country where the silence of American higher education is a huge problem, and it's becoming more and more a problem. So that's where I stand.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Over at American University, where I teach, I run a little program called Disagree with a Professor. And I have a feeling we're going to have a little bit of a disagree with a professor here, because this is an issue about which people have very, very wide opinions. So I don't usually, though, think almost any question is a binary yes/no question at its core. I don't know anybody who thinks, for example, that universities should not issue a statement about a current, flood warning or tornado warning on campus because they never issue institutional statements. And I don't know anybody who thinks that, the president should just have their social media open at all times, or like have their press secretary following them to make a statement on everything. So the question is sort of whether, how, and when. I want to start this with a question for Tom that I'll invite others to chime in on this question, since this isn't a yes/no to institutional statements. No one, whether from on the Calvin end of things, believes there are none, or on the HBCU tradition of activism and advocacy and believes they're constant. So the question becomes, under what circumstances should an institution or its subdivision or program, and we do have a question about subdivisions and programs in the Q&A, under what circumstances should they issue a statement? What's the threshold that overcomes this hesitancy to declare oneself a we and say what we think? And I'll start with Tom and move to the others.
Thanks, Lara. That's a great question. And even in the Calvin Report, there is an exception. And that has to do with situations in which the university and its community of learners is itself threatened. And so one prominent example is when the Trump administration passed the immigration restrictions, our president spoke out and said, this is interfering with our ability to recruit students, to have faculty from all over the world, which we need to do. And it's a fundamental threat, and therefore I'm going to speak out. And the way it sort of works is like, it's up to the leaders to decide when the exception exists. But if he had done something that was out of line with the faculty's general opinion, he would have heard from us. And he didn't. I think that was widely supported because we all recognized it was a threat. So that's one example. Obviously, internal things. Take this conflict in Israel and Palestine. you obviously can reach out to students who are really deeply affected, we know, all over, and we all saw the hearings yesterday, that to reach out with counseling resources and things like that. That's appropriate, I think. What isn't, in my view, and I really focus as an international lawyer on foreign policy conflicts. I think, for those kind of things, silence isn't violence. A lot of times people don't know much about conflicts that occur 6,000 miles away. But when the University of California, and I'll pick on that institution because I think it's a pretty egregious violator of this kind of principles, when the president says, Russia is the aggressor in the Ukraine, or some such thing, they're really telling people on campus what the right view is instead of inviting them to inquire. And that's one of the reasons I'm very concerned. Let me just say one other thing about that on the foreign policy things. From my point of view, these things are always partial. I found many, many statements about Ukraine. I saw not one about the Ethiopia war, which was as deadly and displaced more people in a comparable period of time. We're not seeing much about Sudan now. We see a lot about Israel and Palestine. And so there's always a partialness to these things that I think, in a way, privileges some conflicts ontologically. And I think that's a problem too. I'll just say one last thing. I'm sorry to keep talking, but from my point of view, having been looking into this, to me, the university leader statements generally are not, they don't do much good or bad. They kind of, because no one really pays much attention to them on campus, I don't think. Sorry, John. I know you were president, but but to me, the departments are far worse than these things. When departments are speaking out, and we have many of them in the University of California system on Palestine that have been there for years, it's basically saying to everyone in the department, there's only one view here, and it squelches the incentive to inquire. So I think it really undercuts us. But just as you said, there are definitely exceptions, and it's important to think about when they are and to exercise judgment about when those cases are. That's why we hire presidents to make those calls.
Don or Neijma, do you want to jump in on this?
I'll make a comment. I agree with you, Tom. I do believe that the statements are one thing, and you can't speak about everything, and silence is not always betrayal. The tradition I'm speaking about is the silence during, let's say, for instance, human enslavement for a considerable time, when if education was going on the campus, and we have a vision, we have at a certain point, we had a constitution that outlined the kind of country we were supposed to be living in, then you educate for that. And I think you're spot on to pinpoint the issue of we. Who is the we? The we has never been, well, actually, it's been crystal clear in this country for most of the time. It's been crystal clear. And this has been a white male aristocracy for a long time, and that's who the we was. The we has slowly and grudgingly drawn a wider circle, this country has, in response to protests, in response to speaking up. And that's how, so I think on our campuses, one of the best things we can do, all of us, is to grapple with the issue, make it very clear to students, who is this campus? What kind of world are you educating us for? Are you educating us for a pluralistic democracy that is tracked out in the US Constitution, or a racial aristocracy, which is what we've been for? That's the choice. And I think you can make statements about the kind of world that we are educating for on this campus. And that's where I believe HBCUs have gotten that exactly right.
And I will just add that I think one of the things, and this is specifically around the Calvin report itself, I want to say that is, it is not law, right? And I think at times universities use it as a shield, because they don't want to make statements, right? And I think when we think about using that as a framing or guidelines, we really do have to grapple with it, generation to generation. And so when people sort of raise this issue of what is said in the report, I mean, I think it is not a black and white issue. As we've talked about, there are exceptions, and we really do have to be nuanced about it. And I do think it's okay for universities to say we are grappling with this. No one expects that everyone is going to get it right. But there's this expectation that we're not going to issue or say anything because we'll get it wrong. Well, yeah, you might, right? And that's okay. And I think that's part of me, what can be frustrating is this idea that if we don't get it right, or we don't know what to say, we're not going to say anything at all. But I think it's okay to talk about the things that you're grappling with as a leadership, because we all are, and invite that conversation. So that's all I'll add to that.
So
Can I make one more comment, just very quickly? I think that the most important words in this, the three most important words in the Calvin statement are the exceptional instance, right? The exceptional instance, and that's where an institution's judgment has to come in. And one thing I will just flag very quickly is there was a point at which University of Chicago was struggling because they had a lot of students on campus and faculty who were insisting that Chicago make a statement and do something about the genocide going on in Darfur. They had about $1 million of their endowment, more than $1 million wrapped up in that somehow. I'm not even sure how, but they wanted to divest from that. And Chicago stood behind the Calvin report steadfastly, and they had there were thousands of people who signed a statement in protest. And one of the people who signed that statement was John Hope Franklin, an author of the Calvin Committee's report. So he said this is an exception, genocide. It's interesting, given what's going on now in the country now and the debates going on now, that he found that kind of scale. And now at that point, when the exception, he wanted the exception to be made, 400,000 Darfurians had been killed. 400,000. I'll stop there.
Yeah.
So this brings up, right, and the Calvin report, right? The Calvin report happens against a backdrop of universities deciding whether to be involved in a very, very political fact of higher ed integrating the efforts to end a war. This doesn't happen, people are at a philosopher's retreat in a cave and they say, oh, what do we think about the concept of neutrality? Like there's a political moment this is happening in. And one of the things that I think is behind all of this question, and I want to, we'll stay on this weather thing. And I think this wraps in one of the questions in the chat about the institution defining intifada, or for that matter, from the recent congressional hearing, an institution or Congress, for that matter, defining which statements are genocidal or whether there's genocidal intent in a statement. It seems like a lot of the questions or the battles around getting an institution to make a statement are essentially proxy battles around getting somebody in power to agree with you and adopt a concept as the institutional position. Now, there's an argument that, well, okay, institutions shouldn't shut down speech, and I think Tom encapsulated it very well. But institutions do come to conclusions about issues, right? So if you work on a tobacco-free campus, that is the result of often scholarship and science scholarship concluding that tobacco is unhealthy, and that we don't need to have further discussion on campus about whether this is the case. I'm going to draw for you, and I'm going to open it to all three of you to answer, a quotation from Professor Sigal Ben-Porath, who teaches at Penn, from her 2023 book, Cancel Wars, that I think addresses this, and then I'd like to hear your response about the point at which, under what circumstances does a university actually have a position. So the quote is this: "The debate over the intersection of speech, truth, and academic inquiry centers on disagreements over what is self-evident, what is already known and requires no further investigation, and what, on the other hand, can be reconsidered, questioned, or revisited." So whatever order you'd like to sort of reflect on that question. When are questions settled, and which questions are settled from an institutional perspective?
Maybe I'll start if that's okay. I mean, the question really is who decides. So many academic questions have exactly this structure. And by the way, here I disagreed with this document that came out a few months ago, the Princeton Principles, which took the position that literally every question was open for debate. And I just thought, well, that's really not right. We're not going to go back and do phrenology or something like that. You know, we settle questions in academic discussions, and then they're decided. But when does the university get to decide? You know, again, we have this vision, and it's not for every institution. I don't think, you know, everyone has to follow this, but our vision is that the university itself is so thin, it's not capable of imposing those views on the disciplines, on the scholars. And so, you know, I think it's a kind of hard conception in a way to think about that way, because now our institutions are multi-billion-dollar, you know, neoliberal corporations. And I sometimes, when I see a lot of these speeches, I think that they're basically acting just like other big corporations, promoting a brand and, you know, going along with what others are saying. And you know, I remain a little suspect of many of them, but I also don't think it's for everyone. And probably John and I would agree on what Yale should have been doing in 1860. You know, there's no question about that in my mind. But that's our country, that's our community, and by not doing, by going along with the dominant view of the time, they were preventing all kinds of minds from entering the university to begin with, which is the only way we're going to make progress on things. And so I think inclusion is also kind of built into our Chicago principles, though the Calvin statement itself doesn't say that. You've got to be inclusive to have this robust conversation.
I can add to it. If I can answer this practically. When I presided at Morehouse, I had I was very clear about when I wanted to make a statement and when we had to just do something. And so I'll very quickly, I'll tell you the story. We had an election watch in 2016, and in Martin Luther King Chapel at Morehouse College. And this is a chapel that holds 2,500 people. And I would say the place was full, and it was dominated by women because they thought this Spelman student body came over to watch with, and we thought it was going to be history seeing the first woman president of the United States, that being Hillary Clinton. And as the night went on, it became very clear that was not going to happen. And I have to say, I stayed at about midnight, and it was gloomy in there. And I decided we had to convene the campus the next day. And professors who had been there a while said, we haven't felt this way since Dr. King was assassinated. We gotta get together. So we filled up King Chapel again and just processed what just happened as a community a couple days later. I didn't make a statement though. The statement came when I got invited to the White House all HBCU presidents, and half my student body didn't want me to go. They said, no, don't go, don't validate this guy. And I felt I had to go because my absence, having been in the Obama administration just a term before, would have made more of a statement than my presence did. And I wrote a statement to my campus to explain that, to explain why I had to do what I had to do and why that was consistent with our institutional values. And I think statements should be made, and this was my mindset, and this is why I tell this story, in the context of the institutional values, not your personal values, but the institutional values. And if you are unclear about what your institutional values are, then that's the problem.
I will add, one of the things that I think about a lot in terms of when we make statements is impact, right? So I think who has been impacted, what is the impact, how deep the impact is. And again, me having been a trauma clinician for a really long time, I tend to lead with impacts, right? So for example, I live in Baltimore and my campus is situated in Baltimore City. When Freddie Gray was murdered by the police just right in our city, everyone came back to campus. People were just doing their work as usual. And it was clear that the impact was devastated. It was clear that the impact was so deep that in a situation like that, a statement had to be made. Because you had to acknowledge the impact that was happening, not necessarily that you're making a statement so much on the issue, whether you support police or not, but you are making a statement to acknowledge that your community has experienced harm and this is the impact. So for me, it is really, a statement is really a tool to say, I see you, I see that you're hurt, I see that you're harmed, and here's how we can support you. And for me, if you're doing that with your statements, I think it is okay to do that. So I tend to think about it that way, as opposed to necessarily using it as a tool to take a position, though at times you will. But for me, the question that I always come back to is, what is the impact? Who has been impacted, to help figure out making statements or not.
So let me stick with you for a moment, Neijma, because you actually transitioned beautifully to the topic that I really wanted us to take a bit of time with, which is the how, and it's kind of the why. You know, if you were making these statements, what are you really doing, and what is it for, and how do you do it? And I will say that for me, two kinds of statements that make like flames come out of my head. One is hate has no place here, because it's just completely not true, particularly if we actually have a free expression policy. We're saying, you know, hate might have a place here, but we don't like it. Another is, this is not who we are, after one of the we has literally just done the thing, somewhat demonstrating it is exactly who we are. And bringing in Amy Werbell's question in the chat, you know, how do people feel, you know, that feel protected, feel safe, feel well, if the statement says, you know, I see you, but maybe it's taking a side, or maybe it's saying, I see you because I recognize this part of the trauma, but not this other part. So thoughts on that, and then obviously our Tom and John can fill in as well.
So in terms of, are you asking sort of how to go about making these statements? The first thing that I would say is, there's never going to be a perfect statement. So if you're gonna put something out there, just know that it's gonna resonate with some, and it's not, and that's okay. So I think a couple things I always guide our leadership on is first thinking about why are you making this statement, because that is going to be really relevant in terms of how you're crafting it and how you're putting it together. What is the why, right? Are we doing it because we're just being performative? Are we doing it because everybody else is and we feel like we just need to do it? Again, I talked about the impact, right? So who has been impacted and what is the impact? But more importantly, have they been consulted? I can't tell you how many statements that I have seen, and it is clear that the people who you're making a statement about have not been consulted. You have not talked to any Black folks, any Jewish folks, any gay folks, any immigrants. It is clear. Do not make statements about people if you're not talking about the people who you're making the statements about. That sounds really basic, but it happens so many times. So that's definitely one of the things that I would keep in mind. I think the other thing is, what is the university doing, and what is the action that is being taken in conjunction with the statement? Don't just write things and don't have any accountability and action to follow it up. That to me is deeply problematic. So in this statement, you should be clearly outlining what is the action that you're going to take, and how are you going to hold yourself accountable as an institution? That piece to me is often missing. There has to be accountability built in there, or else really it's just words, right? I also think it's important to think about who's your audience and who is this for, right? Not every statement is going to be for everyone. And I think we need to keep that in mind when we're doing that. And also, if there's pushback, not if, when there is pushback, how are you going to respond? I often chuckle when leadership, are surprised that there's pushback and there's no plan for pushback. Have a pushback plan. P squared, I call it pushback plan, because you're going to get pushback and you have to be thinking ahead. What am I going to do when that happens? And Lara, to your point in the things that really kind of grind your gears, I think you and I are on the same page about those type of statements. So do not say things like, these do not align with our values. This is not who we are. Because for a lot of people, particularly those with marginalized identities, it is who you are. We've been on this campus for 5-7 years. We have experienced it. Now you can say, this is not who we want to be. You can say we're aspiring to be better, but there has to be an acknowledgement of the problematic history that the institution has. And the last thing that I would say, because I don't want to keep, talking for too long, I think it's also really important, if you are deciding that you're going in the route of making statements, that you have to be really transparent and specific, right? So another thing that kind of grinds my gears is when people say things like the incidents. Like, what are you talking about? You're very vague, and then you have minimized a whole experience that someone has, right? So what is happening right now in Israel and Gaza it's not an incident, right? Finding a noose on campus is not an incident. A Black man dying at the hands of the police is not an incident. We have to be really specific and name the harm, or else don't say anything at all. So those are just sort of some foundational things that I would offer in terms of us thinking through, if we're going in the direction of making a statement, what should we be thinking about? Hopefully I answered your question.
It was wonderful. And I think this is going to go to John. I'd like, your continuation of this, but with a little bit of a wrinkle, if you will. So wherever we stand about institutional statements, the whether and then the how, which I think Neijma really laid out some important principles, everybody who cares about higher education understands that statements aren't a substitute for meaningful policies, curricular offerings, resources. And what I'd like to hear from you to start, John, and others can jump in, is, what do we want campuses to do, regardless of what they decide to collectively say? And with just a little wrinkle on that. So since we're being very free here among friends with what grinds our gears and annoys us, I occasionally get annoyed by institutions over-promising things, like we're going to make you all safe, or we're going to stop there from being any bias incidents, which isn't possible without the campus becoming a surveillance state. So I get a little upset about that. And I'm not a giant fan either, as are a lot of other people not fans of like institutional bloat, where it's like, thanks for asking us to do something. We've hired 4 more people with very confusing jobs to sort of do some duplicative things. And by the way, your tuition's going up to pay for this. So what is the thing that should be done regardless of what you say? And how do you have a really meaningful response to the things that a campus is hurting over or seeking leadership over, that really is high impact, is directed, and isn't kind of more shuffling of people and resources?
Thanks, Lara. I think 2 words come to mind. Campus community. Campus community. And I would underline the word community. A president's job, and this goes to when you write a statement, is to nurture the community, tend to the community, pay attention to the community. And the best way to do that, I think, I found in my experience, I'll quote somebody, and that's Lara Schwartz. Now you need to shift from statements to real, genuine dialogue. There are a lot of campuses that do not have genuine dialogue. As a matter of fact, a lot of campuses avoid it. They tolerate marginalized people on the campus. They tolerate the phantom students or faculty who are not connected to the community anyway. And I think the best thing a college president can do, a leadership team, administrative team can do, is to advance the institution's capacity to understand who we are as a community and how we advance the common good. And when you get good at that on campus, then I think we can get better at that in America and in the world. You really have to model on campus the world you want to see, and dialogue is the heartbeat of it all. And that's what better thing to do on a college campus than to exchange ideas.
May I jump in? I sometimes think that the language we use around these issues is a little bit of a misnomer. We use the term free speech, which of course refers in the political sphere to the idea that you can go on the soapbox and, dissent and all that. But, that's not really what we're doing in universities. We have to do what John was just referring to, is to create conversations. It takes active construction of certain environments. You have to invest in ways to do that. You've got to find ways to bring people together and have them be, courageous enough to speak their mind, feel secure enough that they can learn in some sense. And so it's a little bit of a misnomer. Just like I was saying before, I think neutrality is a little bit of a misnomer. I do think that we aren't doing as good a job as we can. I think we are, and the country's not doing as good a job as we can. And maybe I'll just say that I think that, just to repeat what John was saying, look, if we can't do this on campus, then there's no hope for the country. So we've got to do this to lead and to become, a place where people can converse across difference and be plural and such. We just have to do a lot better.
And I would emphasize one thing, a conversation, a dialogue. What we saw on the Hill with the 3 presidents was not a conversation. It was a confrontation. It was a gotcha session. It reminded me of the hearings of Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. There were people who were after them and looking for the viral moment, and they got it. Does that mean that they did the right thing with that question? No, it doesn't mean that. But to call for the removal of these presidents because of that, I think is a lot. And I'm hard pressed to imagine that if most of the time in this country we've had white males as college presidents. I've never heard of a president making one mistake on a Hill like that with their words or with their judgment and being removed from office. It was interesting that there were 3 women presidents at that hearing, and they're calling for them to be out of their jobs. And I just say this, full disclosure, I have 3 degrees from Harvard, and I was on the board at Harvard. I think Claudine Gay is going to be a solid president, and one negative instance does not mean that she should be removed from the presidency, or any of the others either. Cornbluth, none of them should be.
I will say, as a person who loves questions and just wrote a book about questions, if you, outside of the context of cross-examination in a court of law, if you see a questioner insisting on a yes/no, that a person treat a hard issue as a yes/no question, it is a good indication to you that the questioner is not trying to understand the issue, but trying to make a point about the person being questioned.
Exactly.
And this is a good, looking at questioning this way is a good practice for all of us. Some of us watched that as free speech experts and kind of knew what was up. Some of us watched it just as concerned citizens. And this is a good thing to do when you're watching people interact. Ask yourself, is the person asking questions really trying to understand? Because to my colleague John here's point, we're looking for dialogue, and dialogue and cross-examination are just not the same thing. So we've got a lot of great questions in the chat, one of which I think people might decline to answer, but I'm going to put it to the 3 of you because it's been asked multiple times in the Q&A, which is, well, what should people have said about October 7th or related subsequent issues? Is there an answer to this that any of you has?
Do you mean in the hearings yesterday?
No, what should an institution have said? Although an answer in the hearings, I'm that girl, so I actually typed up my own answers for myself. And so I'm available to be president of Harvard if anyone needs me, but I agree that the actual incumbent is doing a good job. But what would you say any of you that would issue a statement, for example, about October 7th or about the bombing of Gaza or anything related? Is there an institutional statement that you think is appropriate, if you do think a statement is appropriate?
Well, from my point of view, of course, no statement should be issued, but the problem is universities were issuing the statements we've been discussing. And, it's even the case. Actually, this is something that Neijma said earlier, I wanted to comment on, which is, if let's say, God forbid, a hate crime occurs on your campus, absolutely. I mean, it's our community. You have to speak up and condemn and, help people work through that. What if it's just in your town? And I understand about the Freddie Gray thing, and I think that it's the right thing to do for your school. But if a school like ours, which doesn't say much, I think that the answer is, well, we do have obligations to the community, but it's not necessarily the case that we would speak up then. Now, if you are a school which has a pattern of speaking up and then you didn't speak up on October 8th, it does look kind of bad, I have to say, because it was a pretty severe and indefensible crime. In my field, we saw people actually sort of celebrating it in international law. Oh, this is the resistance, this is October 8th I'm talking about. And, I think probably if you're used to making statements, you should speak up then. Now, here we are. Then you have the incredible overreaction, which has now led to something like 17,000 deaths. And if you were going to make a statement about the Israeli suffering, I think you have to make one about the Palestinian suffering. And you're going to get beat up because it's a highly polarizing issue. But I guess consistency is all I would ask.
I think that's right. I would, again, the way I think about this is there were circumstances in which my campus community was demanding a statement. And that's because it was Morehouse. And so you have to at certain points you have to speak up. We have to recognize that there were some presidents who were under pressure to make a statement by donors, very wealthy donors. It's not just the campus community. And as a president, I might make a statement in response to some pressure, but the kind of statement I would make is there are 32 wars, active wars going on in the world right now, 32 of them. A disproportionately high number of the larger ones are going on the continent of Africa. Most of the world knows nothing about them. Why? So instead of isolating one of the 32 wars and privileging that and doing all this, I would, as an institution, I would be comfortable standing against war. Standing against war. Now, of course, we got to a situation in this latest controversy where the call for a ceasefire became controversial. And that's tough. That's where you really have to draw a line. I never believed that saying stop the killing is somehow problematic. I'm going to hold on to peace. I'm going to say stop the killing no matter what. Stop the killing. And what have we been emphasizing in this dialogue? Dialogue. Dialogue is the way out. So statements, what you have to do when you generate a statement is get your readers to the higher ground. You know, make a statement from the balcony, or as Dr. King would say, from the mountaintop, and usher your readers up to a higher level, to higher ground. That's what statements, if a statement doesn't do that, then it probably shouldn't be written.
I would just chime in just to say, I think if statements were made, I think it would have been really important for impact and harm to be acknowledged in those statements. So I'm always going to go back to that. And the statements that I saw, to answer your question, that did an okay job were those that acknowledged that there was harm and there was hurt. I also want to say that it is really important for us to have a power analysis when we think about these things. And what I mean by that is not everybody, the consequences for making statements is not the same for everyone, right? So I am a Black immigrant woman. Tom, you're a white man. We can see that. The consequences for me as a leader making a statement will be very different. So I want us to really think about how power plays a role in this, and how what you look like and what your background is does matter in the decision that you make, whether you're thinking about, should I speak or not? And I will be 100% honest with you all. As a Black immigrant woman in leadership, a lot of times I want to speak, but I do not feel safe because the consequences of what it means to me could be life or death. And I don't think that a lot of people always realize that. There's always a demand. You're in leadership, you need to make a statement. Yes, and we need to understand how power works, and we need to, sorry, I muted myself. Yes, I am in leadership, but we also need to understand how power works, and we need to understand how power works in this country. And I think I say that to say, because I do think that there are a lot of university presidents who have a lot of social capital and can speak out, and they do not tap into their privilege. And that often falls on the back of a lot of marginalized people doing this work, and it is not fair. So we have to understand how power works if we're going to have this conversation. And I'll leave it at that.
Speaking of power, I'm wondering, Tom or John, if you could weigh in. Everyone seems to agree that threats to the academic enterprise itself are appropriate times for institutions to speak up. So if there's a threat to the academic mission or freedom of the institution or to its operations. My question, there were a couple of questions in the chat about threats to academic freedom in places like Florida. Do you think that that college presidents who have more power and safety in their statement making power need to be making statements on behalf of academia, academic freedom, inquiry, education in general, or even free speech in general, particularly even if their own institution is, private or in a state where these things aren't threatened?
You'd think we could find common ground on those things. I mean, you really would. But for whatever reasons, we cannot. Saying I'm against banning books and you're a college president, it's like motherhood and apple pie. I mean, how hard is that? How hard is it to come out? But you have presidents in fear of saying that, and I dare say, especially in red states, so there are two Americas now. I mean, at least two, and basically, in one of the Americas, that is more tolerable, Lara. The banning of the books and the curating now, shutting down DEI offices, curating curricula now to eliminate courses and faculty members. As all that stuff is going on, not just in Florida and elsewhere. This is fundamentally and obviously and starkly at odds with the basic academic freedoms we have celebrated in this country. And it should not be hard to say that, but it is hard in this country to say that. And boy, that is a very, very negative sign.
Tom, thoughts on that?
It ties in with something I was just saying in one of the papers today, which is we got to do a much better job of telling our story of what higher education is doing. What we're really about, why we are essential. The public, and it's not just red states, I don't think, the public increasingly sees us as being not a good value proposition, full of things you can't say on campus. And that's one lens through which I view this particular moment, where there's kind of hysteria about these non-self-defining terms. What is anti-Semitism? Your definition, mine might be quite different. Mine's certainly different than Elise Stefanik's. But we've gotten to a place where kids often don't want to confront ideas that they don't already agree with. We've gotten to a place where the public perceives us as being more about indoctrination than about education. And the problem with that, it's that you can't have democracy without educated citizens. You can't have democracy without free universities. You can't have democracy without truth-telling. So, I see us, having to go back to these kind of core things, and there's nothing at all in tension between that and having an inclusive society. The contrary, from my perspective.
I think that's a wonderful note to conclude on. I recognize that we could not in an hour reach every possible question or every angle of this. I want to direct people's attention to the excellent reports and guides on campus free expression, educational gag orders, and other pressing issues on PEN America's website, as well as a wealth of scholarship, reports, resources, and tools on the University of California National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement website. You can also learn about the opportunity to be a fellow with the center, which is a great joy and a resource for people across higher ed and outside higher ed. And please join me in thanking our brilliant and thoughtful panelists, who I think you can agree I would spend much, much longer listening to the three of you. So thank you. And thank you everyone who joined in. I believe we are recorded and this will be made available. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.